Well, welcome back, and we're in Jeremiah chapter 35 today. And I've called this an example of obedience. Examples are great things. They help us to see what's sometimes commanded, what's often described. When we have a real live example of something, it's really helps us to understand and have a motivation, I think, to do what the example illustrates. I think it also can be very convicting. I believe Mark Twain once said that there's nothing more irritating than a good example. And that's what we have here. Is we have a good example in chapter 35, example of obedience. Again, that's the title for my chapter today, is an example of obedience. It's in this section describing what's happened to Jerusalem before the fall of this chapter and up to chapter 36. And what we're talking about here is the Rechabites. So the Rechabites, we'll discuss who they are and where they come from. But the big picture here is they really have honored their ancestors, honored their father by obeying his stipulations for them. This is in sharp contrast to the Jews, who have dishonored God, their father, by their disobedience. Specifically Zedekiah. Zedekiah has led the nation, and he's led them into disobedience. So I've divided this into three sections. Verses 1 to 11 are honoring Jonadab. Verses 12 through 17 are dishonoring the Lord. Verses 18 through 19 talk about the result of that dishonor. So let's go on. Let's see what's going on here. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah. So verse 1, this puts it between about 609 and 597. So this is before chapter 34. It's several years before. And as we talked about, I've talked about before anyway, Jeremiah is not chronologically organized. He's topically organized. Verse 2 tells us about the Rechabites. They were a nomadic tribe. They're not part of Israel. They're actually related, as far as we can tell, to Jethro, who was Moses' father-in-law. We get to verse 2. He says, "Go to the house of the Rechabites." He's sending Jeremiah. "And speak to them and bring them to the house of the Lord into one of the chambers, then offer them wine to drink." Now, what we'll find in this section from verses 2 through 10 is that the patriarch of the clan, Jonadab himself, had made them pledge to drink no wine and to live as nomads. So God is, of course, here now instructing Jeremiah to call them to the temple and offer them wine to drink. But with very good integrity, they say in verse 8, "We have obeyed the voice of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, in all that he commanded us, to drink no wine in all our days, ourselves, our wives, our sons, and our daughters." So this is kind of a setup, right? We can say that they're invited in, offered wine to drink. God knows fully well that they are going to stay loyal to this covenant they've made with Jonadab. That's his point. That's the point he's making. Notice also in verse 8 that it's not so much the stipulations that Jonadab has given them. He's not honoring the fact that they don't drink wine or they live as nomads. That's not the point. The point is that they are honoring Jonadab by careful obedience to him, even though they're far removed from him. God gets to the point in verses 12 through 17. He speaks a word of chastening for Judah through Jeremiah in verse 12. He says, "Thus says the Lord," in verse 13, "Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, go and say to the people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, will you not receive instruction and listen to my words, declares the Lord? The command that Jonadab, the son of Rechab, gave to his sons to drink no wine has been kept, They drink none to this day, for they have obeyed their father's command. I have spoken to you persistently, but you have not listened to me. Well, here's the point, right? Jonadab's descendants were obedient. This is contrasted to the specific and continuous, persistent disobedience of Judah and Jerusalem. Notice in verse 15 as well, God had warned them again and again that they would not listen. Jeremiah is not the only prophet that was sent. There were several others. Indications even in Isaiah and Jeremiah so far that there's prophets active in the land that we don't even know their names. So it seems as if the Lord was sending prophet after prophet and they would rejected them. You know, it reminds me of Jesus' lament for Jerusalem in Matthew 23:37. Jesus weeps over the city, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. These are the people that God persistently sent to Israel. And they stoned them and they killed them. Jesus says, how often I have wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Well, this is a deep lament. Jesus recalling the very words, I think, here that Jeremiah is talking about, and really the history of Judah and Jerusalem. The contrast is stark in verse 16. The sons of Jonadab, the son of Rechab, have kept the command that their father gave them, but this people have not obeyed me. Starting in verse 18, then, we see the result. The results of the actions of the Jews and the Rechabites are just as stark as the difference between their behavior. Verse 18, we see the disaster is pronounced is the destruction of Jerusalem and Judah in the exile of the people. This is clear what's going to happen. Verse 19, we see Rechab's reward. He is going to be rewarded for their faithfulness by giving the opportunity and the task to serve the Lord. Later on, in the time of the restoration, or this initial restoration of Israel, in Nehemiah 3:14, we see a Rechabite who is in Jerusalem, helping to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And we also see in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, big word, it's called the Septuagint. The title over Psalm 71 is addressed to the sons of Jonadab. So, whereas God's own people, Judah and Jerusalem, were disobedient and were going to be punished, these Rechabites were faithful to their father, and God rewarded them for that, for being such a great example. So by way of application, I could lament a little bit here, I guess. I think sometimes the world is more diligent, we could say more faithful, in sticking to its ungodly principles than the church is in sticking with its godly principles. The church seems so frequently ready to compromise, whereas the world is strictly adherent to its worldly philosophies. I pray, brothers and sisters, that you and I would be strengthened by God's Spirit working in us so that we can be exemplary and above reproach in our obedience to the Lord and to the laws of the land we live in, both. Just as we see here that the Lord calls us to obedience to His word and submission to the government as far as we can, may we be exemplary and above reproach in both cases. Well, God bless you. God bless you in your reading. And tomorrow or next day we'll be in this next section of Isaiah or Jeremiah, seeing what is happening in Jerusalem just before the fall. God bless you.